cursed, I'm not jinxed. God is not repulsed or turned off by me to say that I can't have the desires of my heart. Hey there again, good people. I'm back with part 2 of Grappling with Unmet Desires. In part 1, I mentioned that unfulfilled desires can be just about anything, but they tend to fall in 4 key areas: relationships, career/purpose, health, and our finances. Now, there's some nuance to each of those areas, but general principles of grappling with unfulfilled desires applies no matter which of the 4 areas you're grappling with. By the way, if you happen to be grappling with your life's purpose, please check out the Life Purpose series that I did. I think that might be very helpful to you. So in part 1 of this series, I focused a bit more on health because so much of it can be out of our control that it can really feel like we just got a raw deal. So if you're specifically discouraged because of your health, then I encourage you to check out that particular video. Also in part 1, I made this statement. So if God is not the problem and we're not the problem, then what is the problem? Well, 2 things come to mind. So those 2 things that come to mind are, 1, our adversary, i.e. the devil. And the second one is probably the biggest wild card of all, other people. But there is actually one other thing that I don't want to gloss over though, us, our role. I want to clarify what I meant when I said if we aren't the problem. What I mean by that is there's nothing inherently wrong with an earnest desire. There is nothing inherent about us that makes a desire unmanifestable, if you will. See, for a brief period, I started to feel like I was jinxed or something. If I would go off into fantasy land, la la land, dreaming about something, I would find myself saying, well, if I'm dreaming it, then it's not going to happen for me, because it never happens for me. Someone else could dream the exact same thing. Somehow they have the Midas touch and it works out for them, but not so for me. Well, that's a bunch of bull. I'm not cursed. I'm not jinxed. God is not repulsed or turned off by me to say that I can't have the desires of my heart. And like I said in the God's Will series, perfection is not required. That's what I mean when I say that we aren't the problem. At the same time, we can become the problem because of our wounds, our immaturity, our insecurities, and or some other type of lack. We very much can get on our own way. We very much can self-sabotage ourselves because of feelings of unworthiness. All of these things, our wounds, immaturity, and insecurities, prevent us from recognizing the right person or the right opportunity. Our judgment is off and needs to be retuned. And an intentional effort is required to retune. It's not an automatic process. Time doesn't heal all wounds automatically. Whoever made that statement was probably under the assumption that we're forever learning, growing, maturing, and evolving as time goes on. But we all know of situations and people where time can be ticking away and they still abide by the same way of thinking. And in the end, they end up overlooking the very person, place, or thing that could be the very manifestation of the desire or connection to that manifestation. So a therapeutic intervention of some kind is usually necessary to recalibrate our judgment. Now, it can come formally with an actual therapist. It can be through self-help, and it could be through having honest, vulnerable conversations in a safe space with people that you trust. Okay. So now that I've cleared that up, let's move on to the devil. Now, I don't want to blow this out of proportion because in the end, it might only be a minor factor. But we do have an adversary. Evil can be exacted upon us. And the moment that our enemy strikes can be devastating. Physical violence, sexual violence, hatred, emotional abuse, and as awful as it sounds, our desires and even our lives can become casualties of evil. Now, I don't mean to sound dark and grim. I'm just trying to be circumspect here. The trauma associated with these evil acts has to be dealt with because it can truly paralyze us and keep us from even trying to go after what we want and prevent us from realizing God's will in our lives. And it only takes one hit to have lasting effects. It's that one hit and the ongoing memory of that one hit that can stagnate us. All it takes is for that memory to be triggered and we could be sent backwards. One of my friends helped me realize this when she told me that I was just really being spooked by the memory of a traumatic event. And I was pissed and got fighting mad. I got filled with righteous indignation and began to fight back because I refused to let the enemy win. Of course, it got heavy for a little bit, but I refused to back down and fall so low. But like I said, I don't want to get too long-winded on this point. My ultimate point is that we do face spiritual opposition, and that can throw things off for us when it comes to realizing God's will in our lives. Now on to the biggest wild card of all, other people. Most of our desires requires the involvement and agreement of other people, and their involvement and agreement are not guaranteed. There's a selflessness often required that other people are not always willing to be. They have a free will just like we do. Now, I alluded to this in part 2 of the God's Will series with the example of slavery. Freedom is indeed God's will, but slave masters didn't lean into it. And as such, slavery was endured far longer than it needed to be. We live in human systems that don't necessarily align with God's way of doing things. Folks know better, but they don't always do better. On an individual level, fear overtakes many people. We hear testimonies of people all the time that say they ran from their calling. They ultimately tell these testimonies because they finally submitted. But everybody doesn't submit. Everybody doesn't have a change of heart. Those stories will never be told because they won't admit to not doing what they're supposed to do if they never intend to do what they are supposed to do. And they definitely have a hard time admitting that when it comes to doing right by other people when they don't do it. Another point about us here in the U.S. specifically is the fact that we can be especially superficial and in this rat race to make a name and better life for ourselves. And we don't pause long enough to notice what and who we should indeed pay attention to. Other people's prayers could very well be answered, but they get caught up in their own worlds and they can't see what's always staring them in the face. Financially, many of us who have been oppressed are in a perpetual state of running from behind. Calls for leveling the playing field are dismissed by people that can make a difference. It's not because we are unworthy or that God doesn't want that for us, but we operate in a world that, like I said before, doesn't always see things the way God does. We have to fight for progress. It shouldn't be that way, but because we know it's not God's will for us to be left impoverished and left behind, we're actually left to fight for it. And sadly, many of us die fighting, or we become collateral damage in somebody else's mess. It's not God's will, but realities that we have to process, accept, and move on from. Moving on with our hearts intact. Which segues to my final point. Ultimately, the biggest question here is, how do we relate to God when our hearts have gone from being sick to totally broken? Ministers usually say this in a much more scolding way. Would you still serve God if you don't get what you want? Or are you serving God just to get what you want? Now, I don't think the word serve is the right word here. I think the question is, will we now operate our lives from a place of anger, frustration, and rebellion? Will we now operate our lives from a broken place? Or will we seek to be made whole? God's will is indeed for our hearts to be intact. God's will is for us to heal, recover, and that our hearts be made whole. And a key piece of that healing requires letting go. I think we hold on so tightly because we think letting go means that we are okay with things not working out. And holding on keeps us attached in faith, while letting go means admitting defeat. But truthfully, letting go is simply the realization that there's nothing that we can do to turn this around in our favor. It's not saying that we're okay that it didn't work out. It's actually very gut-wrenching. And you don't really have to like it one bit. You're not denying that you want it, but once you've exhausted all that you can do in your power to affect the situation, it's an admission that you really on your own can't make it happen. So you let it go, and if apart from you it comes back around, you will gladly pick it back up again because it is indeed your heart's desire. But if and until then it's out of your hands. And believe it or not, the peace that comes from that is unexplainable. It truly is the peace that surpasses all understanding that guards our heart and our mind. So I know I just said a lot, and I hope I was able to articulate my thoughts in a helpful way. I'd certainly like to keep the conversation going in the comments. How have you grappled with unfulfilled desires? I'd love to hear about your experiences, and like I said, keep the conversation going. Well, that is all for now. I will see you later, good people.